It's wonderful to see so many of you here today, so many old friends and some new friends, and an incredible honor to have a book launch at Brookings, where I've been affiliated now for 22 years, which is a very long time. Special thanks to Darrell West, Vice President of the Governance Studies Division, who's made this possible, and especially the wine and refreshments, which we'll all enjoy afterwards, and above all, thanks to the two of you. I just can't imagine two better people to talk with about happiness in America. You know these people. To my left, Barbara Bradley Hagerty, who had a long career at NPR, was recently named a contributing editor of Atlantic and is the author of this wonderful book. I can't recommend it too highly, especially to someone who's reinventing in middle age. It's called Life Reimagined: The Science, Art, and Opportunity of Midlife. Emphasis on the word art, which is really interesting. Maybe we'll talk about that, the art of getting this right. And David Brooks, who needs no introduction in Washington. He's, of course, a columnist for the New York Times, the author of many books, most recently The Road to Character in 2015, and I would argue the country's most interesting and prominent author on issues around character and civic culture. I'm kicking it off before turning it over to David, just because I want to show you a few images to get the conversation started. We're going to kind of think of this as a sort of book club experience. This isn't meant to be a formal presentation, but just to give you a sense of the background of this book and what's maybe a little bit interesting about it. In a way, the story of this book begins in around 1842. These are four images that are situated 2 miles from here in the National Gallery of Art. I first saw them when I was 19 years old. They're quadriptych called The Voyage of Life by the great American landscape artist Thomas Cole. They are magnificent paintings. Here's how they look today, just two of them. They have a room to themselves. They are masterpieces of iconography and draftsmanship. And I still remember, actually, the day when I first encountered them and was 19. And they also formed the leitmotif of my book, because it turns out that they are 170 years approximately ahead of their time. They got the science right about life. Here is the first painting. It's the one that's not particularly relevant today. It's called Childhood. You can see a baby is being born, coming out of the darkness of the womb onto the river of life. But this river isn't just any river. This river is time. One way you can see that, I'm not sure if it's clear here, but the prow of the boat, the figurehead is holding an hourglass. The guardian angel is out of sight of the child, who does not know that he's being monitored and watched over this way. So now the three later paintings become especially relevant. I saw this painting, it's called Youth, when I was the same age as the young man in the boat. As you can see, the guardian angel's now offshore, farther away, farther out of sight. The youth is reaching ambitiously toward the castle in the sky, his dreams of future glory, and as it turns out, future happiness. Part of the iconography here that's really interesting, I don't know if you can see this, but over here, I don't know how the clicker works. It's all right, pointer. I'll just point. Over here where the river bends, you see a dirt road. It's the road that leads to the castle in the sky, but that's the road not taken. From our elevated view, we can see the river's going to turn. The young man doesn't see this, but the river's going to turn away from the castle in the sky and toward rapids. And here's midlife. Manhood. So when I was 20 seeing these pictures, I assumed there was no way my life would look like this, because things would go well and I would be happy about it. You can see here that the man who now in the prime of life, the boat, the tiller is now missing, so he's lost his steering. He's in rapids, he is supplicating the heavens. Again, from our position, we can see what he cannot, which is through a gap in the rocks, we can see their calm waters ahead, but he doesn't know that and has no way to know that. So when I was in my 40s, I began entering these psychological rapids. I became dissatisfied, restless, obsessed with why I was wasting my life. I thought it would be temporary. It got worse. And by the age of 45, I knew I was in trouble when I won the biggest award for magazine journalism out there. And that gave me a sense of satisfaction and fulfillment for approximately 10 days. And then these inner voices, these harpies, you can't really see it, but you can see them in the background there above. They look like clouds, but they're in fact blue-green demons, began harassing me again with the worthlessness of my life, and I became restless and dissatisfied and almost made some serious mistakes. This is the last painting of the four, old age. Now, finally, the Voyager can see the guardian angel. It's ushering him up to the peace of the higher realm. And the voyage is now smooth and soft. So let's fast forward 160 years to this image. This was generated by Carol Graham of Brookings, who I hope is here today, and Milena Nikolova. Yes. There she is in the back. There's a whole chapter about her. She is a pioneer on studies, an economist and study of happiness and age. A very important figure in the book and in my life. Thank you, Carol. This is what researchers call the U-shaped happiness curve. It shows happiness for very large populations, survey population, by age. Now, this is tricky. This is not the happiness of any individual person, nor is it the average happiness of a population. This is what happens when you take a large sample of people all over the United States and you take out everything that's not age: income, education, employment, family, marriage. You take out everything you can take out. It turns out that time itself has an independent effect on how happy you are. It's not overwhelming. It's never the only thing going on. It's like an undercurrent in the river. It doesn't establish where you're going to wind up or what your journey will be like. That depends on your vessel and how hard you steer and how hard you want to get there. But it is a constant undercurrent, and what's telling you is that it's making it harder to be satisfied with life in midlife than at either end. It's not just the United States. This is the world. Same type of curve. You see it's lower because other places tend to be less happy than America. There are lots of country comparisons. So people ask all the time, so what's going on here? Is that because, of the culture, the economy, whatever? Well, we factor those things out, but this really got my attention and got me thinking I needed to write about it and take it seriously, partly because it explained what happened to me, but partly because of this. This is the happiness curve for chimps and orangutans. Same pattern. What you see here today, the science of this is interesting. We're not really here to talk science, but we can talk about it if you guys want to, what's going on. But what's interesting here about the images that you've seen is what you see here, of course, are two images, two graphic representations of exactly the same thing, except Thomas Cole got there 160 years earlier. What does all this mean? Very briefly, and we will talk about it a bit, but just a couple things I want to say to maybe start the conversation. The first is that the way we think about aging and happiness is pretty much completely upside down. We think of midlife as a time of mastery when we ought to be on top of things and at our happiest. It's a time of vulnerability. Meanwhile, old age is not a time of misery and unhappiness. Time continues to help you be happy, other things being equal, until your life ends. This graph from Dilip Jeste, a well-known psychiatrist, shows on one line, a declining line, the number of people who are free of disability. And as they age, of course, very fewer and fewer are free of disability. They're dealing with frailty. The other line shows successful aging, which is very similar to satisfaction with life. When Jeste saw this, he found it so surprising, he went back and did a much bigger study, confirmed it, other people had confirmed it. People kept getting happier, even as they became more frail. But we don't know this. Society sends a very different message and a very counterproductive message. If you go to Google and you Google midlife crisis, this is what comes up. I mean, try it yourself. You can see the iconography here is mostly male, though, by the way, there's no gender difference in the happiness curve. It's been looked for everywhere. It comes up nowhere. But the iconography is mostly gendered. It's mostly male. It's the guy with the motorcycle, the guy with the inappropriate females, the guy who's holding a pistol to the head of a bunny. The female iconography is, oh my God, I've got wrinkles, midlife crisis. And of course, the red sports car, which has become the icon, the great icon, the signifier of midlife. It's not always red. Sometimes it's yellow. But there you are. That kind of concept in iconography is completely backwards. There's nothing abnormal or critical or dangerous or wrong or pathological about having trouble feeling happy in midlife. We're wired for it. And viewing it as a crisis, something that's urgent or dangerous that we should be worried about, just makes it all the harder because it isolates people. I did dozens of interviews for the book. You'll find a lot of it is conversations with people. And again, I heard these stories of isolation. People don't even tell their spouse that they're having these issues because their life is great. They don't feel justified. They feel like they'll be whiny, and they also feel like they'll set off alarms. You know, you're going to quit your job and give up the marriage. It's the wrong way to think about it. This is a natural transition in life, in some ways akin to adolescence, and we need to view it as natural, normal, healthy, bring it out of the closet and take people and help people, support people through it. So there you are, and now over to our real moderator, David Brooks. Thank you.
Thank you. So what are you driving?
A 2001 Toyota Echo.
Oh, wow. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard.
Not as sad as I turned 58 on Thursday.
So
it's David's anniversary, by the way. First wedding anniversary. Yeah. We can...
May not see a second, having been here, but so anyway, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Barb. I'm going to turn it over to Barb. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Jonathan Thomas Cole's fifth portrait there was of, it's called Apotheosis and Ecstasy, which is a panel at the Brookings Institution on monetary policy. But I just, Barb, you wrote a book going over some of the same material in a different way, very different way. Right. I remember I read your book, and I remember you saying the midlife crisis was a myth. Mm-hmm. So what do you think?
Well, I think it is a myth, and I think Jonathan's book is terrific. Everyone really should buy it. Midlife crisis, as he points out, we've seen the same science. It is actually a myth. In terms of the happiness curve, I was really interested to see the science shows that people in midlife do something automatically, but they can also do it intentionally. And what they do is they kind of pivot. They shift away from externals, you know, the larger car, more success at work, that kind of thing, toward two things. Laura Carstensen at Stanford has shown this. They focus on other people and a purpose or cause that gives them meaning and joy. And for me, learning about the purpose was actually the big insight from my book. It turns out that purpose in life, if you have a reason to get up in the morning, that actually is fundamental to making you extremely happy in the second half of life. And as I kind of read through the science, I realized that you can kind of divide it into two things. You can divide it into a little purpose and a big purpose. So the little purpose is something I thought about when I met a woman named Kathy Utschneider at Boston College. Kathy trains midlife athletes, elite athletes, and she has this great analogy. She says, you know, when you're young, there are a lot of milestones. You graduate from high school, you graduate from college, you may get married, begin having a family, launch your career. It's just one thing after another. But midlife is like one long run-on sentence, right? There are no periods or commas or semicolons to kind of break up the monotony of responsibility. And her view is that what you need to do in midlife is to have little purposes, little goals. So it can be something like training for a marathon, something untethered to your normal responsibilities. It could be learning Spanish. It could be picking up the guitar after, 20 years. For me, it was cycling, trying to compete in the senior Olympics. So that will give you an enormous amount of joy. Just kind of challenges to punctuate your life and give it some joy and meaning. And then you have the big purpose, and that one's harder, and it takes a lot of thought. But that is beginning to think, well, let me just tell you, when I was writing my book, I was thinking about the fact that I've been a writer for, 35 years now. And It's absolutely true. I will never be as elegant or successful a writer as either of these two men here, right? They are terrific. So when you realize that, you go, okay, I'm in my mid-50s, and I may not win a Pulitzer, so what do you do about that, right? This is a conversation I had. And what I realized is instead of kind of scrambling for more accolades and, trying to get more prizes and things like that, I had to shift to something that had intrinsic meaning in my career, that it didn't matter if I got accolades. And so I began to kind of pivot in my career to think about what can I do that's uniquely, that I'm uniquely good at doing, that is meaningful, and that every day I feel good about it, regardless of whether anyone notices or not. It's not giving up. I have a lot of energy. I'm going to keep writing as long as I can. But it was that insight that helped me enormously shift my career in a way that gave me kind of great joy and a purpose and gave me a reason to get up in the morning.
Okay, let me give one reaction, and I'm going to push a bit against the whole idea of happiness research. I hesitate to do it with Carol in the room, but just for the sake of discussion. So I wrote a book about 10 years ago called The Social Animal, which had early bits of some of the research as far as I understood it. And I confess I've gotten a little let down by the whole field. And I do it because a lot of the research is based on asking people, are you happy? And asking in a number of ways. Are you happy at the moment? And is your whole life project going well? And if you ask that question of Donald Trump, I feel highly confident he would say it's going awesomely. But if you ask that question of Abraham Lincoln, there might be a few more ups and downs. And then I think pick out any novel. If you ask that question, my favorite novel is Anna Karenina. If you ask the question of Karenin, Anna's husband, who's a total schmuck, he would probably give you himself very high scores. If you asked it of Levin, who's the hero and a really great man in the novel, up and down. And so, do I really want to go by the measure that Donald Trump rates himself very highly on, or would I rather have Abraham Lincoln and be unhappy? And it seems to me, and this is not an original thought to me, that there are different qualities of happiness. And if you evade the qualitative question, then you're evading the thing. And to me, you could rate those qualities. You could say, well, there's material happiness, having a nice car. There's ego happiness, winning success. There's intellectual happiness of learning things and getting a greater understanding of the world. There's generative happiness, giving back to society. There's eros, romantic happiness, which is the fusion of one soul with another, one heart with another. And then there's transcendent happiness, which is a feeling of oneness with creation and with truth and beauty and justice. And Plato would say our purpose in life is to climb from one lower desire to the higher desires. And that seems to me what our actual purpose is. And it's not that happiness research is irrelevant to that quest, but it seems to me at best orthogonal and not addressing the core process of our lives, which is getting higher and more virtuous desires. And so again, I'm pushing this argument a little harder than I actually believe. But I think if you pushed it as far as you could say, happiness research is an attempt to find an amoral way to define how well your life is going, and that's probably not possible.
Interesting. When I talk to happiness researchers, or at least the more sophisticated ones, they're aware of this, and they draw a distinction. There are these three types of happiness that they measure. One is, we get into the science here, but it's relevant, so I'll put it out there. One is affective, and that's how good do you feel today? And that's answered with questions like, how often did you smile yesterday? And then you've got something called evaluative happiness, and that's very different, and that gets much closer to the Aristotelian idea of happiness, and that's how do you evaluate your life as a whole. That's life satisfaction. And it turns out to be very different from mood. In my 40s, I had a contentment disorder, but not a mood disorder. I wasn't particularly depressed. But I felt like my life wasn't fulfilling in some way, that there was some kind of striving that I hadn't reached. And the problem was that became a self-feeding downward spiral. It was becoming an obstacle to my feeling grateful for the things that I felt I should be grateful for, a great relationship, an amazing career and on all those other things. So I felt the happiness curve as, in a way, fighting my attempt to be virtuous by being grateful for what people around me had done for me. And there's another concept of happiness which I don't really understand. It's called Eudaimonic, and it's even closer to what you talk about, and that's the big question of purpose in life. But so researchers understand this, and the kind of happiness that you see with the U-curve is in fact evaluative, and it's largely Aristotelian. I talked to an economist, a famous guy, John Hallowell, who studies this. He calls himself Aristotle's research assistant. Because it turns out the things that help elevate life satisfaction look a lot like the things that the ancients, both in the West and in the East, valued. Caring for others, compassion, giving back, close, trusted connections, the daily virtues of life, the things that make up what you call character. So yeah, I'd say you're pushing a bit too hard, and actually the science here can do more to help you than you might realize.
I was going to bring up Aristotle as well. I mean, Carol Riff, who's a researcher at the University of Wisconsin, says that happiness is overrated. And she's getting to your point, which is that short-term hedonic happiness doesn't do you a lot of good in the long term. But eudaimonia, the kind of happiness which comes from long-term goals, raising good kids, it often involves deferred gratification. It doesn't make you happy in the moment, but it makes you happy over the long term, because you can look back with satisfaction and say, all of that was worth it. And what I would say is, if we could switch out the word, if we could use the word meaning rather than happiness, I think midlife is a very meaningful time of life. Yes, it's freighted with responsibilities, but it is also, those responsibilities are powerful and meaningful, about your kids, about taking care of your parents, doing the right thing, working in a job that gives meaning, that volunteering, all of these things are very, I think, in the long term are very satisfying. And so I think happiness is probably, it is really terrific for a catch-all, and it's a great word for a title of a book. But you are talking about something much deeper than happiness. You're talking about eudaimonia, you're talking about, these longer-term qualities.
Yeah, and people I talked to and interviewed understood the distinction very well. It's actually very intuitive. People have no problem when surveyed or when you talk to them rating their life satisfaction very differently from their mood.
What about, does the concept of happiness imply that we do things in order to be happy? And so, for example, we're all proponents of marriage up here. When you get married, do you think, well, I'll marry this person because this person will make me happy? And I'm suspicious of that, because if that's why you went into it, as soon as you stop being happy, you'll stop being married. And so is happiness really more thought of as a byproduct of a life oriented towards something else?
That's a great question. Would you like to go with that one?
The sages say that, at least in this bigger sense of happiness, of life well lived, fulfillment, the worst way to get that is by aiming for happiness. You aim at other things.
Right.
And that's right. But here's where kind of what's going on in the brain behind the U-curve is interesting. We've got now psychology on this, brain science, a lot of data from economics. And what they seem to show is that the things that we chase in order to make ourselves happy, first, they're kind of set by our animal brain, by our lizard brain. If you think you're going to change that by going to university and reading Plato, probably not. And early in life, we tend to chase status and achievement. We try to put in the bank all of the connections that we can and the degrees, and we try to get a lot of altitude, and we compare ourselves with others. We're competitive, we're ambitious, and that, of course, is what Thomas Cole is showing you. And then we expect if we succeed at these things, well, then, of course, we'll be happy, and that's what I expected, and then I succeeded at those things, and they didn't make me happy. I felt less happy, which goes to your point. Meanwhile, in the background, ticking along, what time is doing, you can even see this in brain scans, is it shifting our priorities away from the rat race, the competition, and toward connection, compassion, the kinds of things, the small joys in life that turn out to be not so small. Like being there to babysit for the neighbors when they have an emergency, the sense of community you get, the hobbies that can develop into social networks. Mm-hmm. It's not only what you said, Barb, which is that we can do these things to become happier. It's easier to get happy, to appreciate them as you get older. And this has been shown in the brain. Older people are more positive in outlook. They're less prone to regret. They're better at equanimity, at dealing well with extremes of emotion. They're good at navigating interpersonal relationships. So we transition toward this later stage where we tend to value more the things in life that make us happier.
It's a really good question. I guess what I would agree with you. Sometimes I think of happiness as being a lure to get you to do something that you should do anyway. I mean, I was very happy when I got married to my husband. And of course, right away you begin having bumps in the road, right? But it's that core happiness, that remembrance of the kind of the hedonistic happiness that kept me going until I could develop a longer term kind of happiness, a greater commitment, something that was more sacrificial. And I don't know, maybe it's just kind of, we aren't automatically sacrificial at the outset, but we become that way, I think. And I think your point about, what I love to realize is that if you're unhappy right now, if you're middle-aged, just wait, because your brain actually will make you happier. I mean, neurologically, what happens is that your brain, you begin to process things differently. You begin to focus on the positive. You become a glass half full, not half empty person. It actually neurologically happens. You begin to kind of shift to those things that matter and perhaps might be more in your control, like the tenor of your relationships or the meaning and purpose in your life, the stuff that you invest in that's worthwhile or not. And so, and we automatically begin to do that. So what I always remember if I'm having a bad day is, you know what, it's gonna get better, it'll be better tomorrow, and it'll just be better until I'm like 80. Isn't that great news?
Yeah, I on this point, for me, one of the formative interviews in the book, did I mention the book? Did I mention that it'll be available here for buying and signing? One of the formative interviews was a friend in her mid-50s who had been around this curve and described it to me, and she said, it's not that my life has changed. I do the same things I always did, but they feel different. There was an added element of richness as she began to feel more returns from taking care of her daughter, going to church, things which when she was younger didn't seem as significant. And that's gradually true in my case. I kind of turned this corner when I was 50. I mean, please, this is a secret from my publisher. So don't let the word get out of this room. But 20 years ago, I thought being on the New York Times bestseller list would be like the best thing ever and a great achievement. And now it would be nice, but just to have a good book out there that's decent and helps some people and is the best work I can possibly do and feels like a contribution, that seems way more important. I don't know, you're a New York Times columnist, have you? Is that like always great? Or is that...
It's actually never great. Let me ask you, I'm tempted to ask two questions, so I'll ask them both together. The first is, if we had a 21-year-old here, can you short circuit this whole deal? Like, can you say, don't worry about it, or are we doomed? I always thought that the bottoming it out at age 47 was mostly related to having teenage children. But, you've taught me it's more. But the second thing, and both your books actually filled me with this sentiment. I also work at a show called The NewsHour on PBS, and when you work on that show, you get familiar with an older demographic. My joke is that if a 93-year-old lady walks up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. But one of the things that both your books encouraged me about was that there is sort of because of increased longevity, increased energy, there is sort of another phase of life. And that there's a new phase of life sort of in your 20s. People spend the decade because they have a long time before they get married, just sort of wandering. while their parents go crazy. But then 65 to maybe 80, you've got this this second career thing. I think of it as a second mountain. People who thought, oh, I had this mountain to climb in my life, but they realize they've got another mountain. And it encouraged me that the midlife point, when you've got enough, you can see the end, but it's still pretty far away and you've got a lot of energy and hopefully you've got your identity together, is actually the moment to take the big risk in life. Yeah. And to make the big leap in life. And you both describe this, what I think of as a surge that starts in midlife, when you really swing for the home run. So if you could just talk about that. Yeah,
did you know, maybe Barbara, you'd be better on the reinvention, but it's interesting, people don't know this, but productivity of elder people is just as high as younger people, and they make others around them more productive. People in their 50s and beyond do more startups than people in their 20s and 30s. This is actually a generative time. And the stereotype that the best is over when you're 50 is completely the opposite of the truth. So on the first one, can you short circuit it? And then I'll pass it to you, the second one. I explored that question in the book by talking to people who had had severe turbulence in their life. So remember, this curve, it's the undercurrent in the water, but it's not telling you what's happening to you on any given day. So, for example, I talked to someone who is about my age, who's in her early 40s. One of her parents had cancer, and then she had a cancer scare, which wasn't cancer, and then her husband had a severe health problem, which took years to resolve, and she got breast cancer, the real thing, not a scare. So she's going through all of this in her 40s, and she comes out the other side, and you wouldn't wish this on anyone. But the result was kind of to accelerate this turn around the bend, because she came out of it saying, you know, when I just sit in a park watching kids play, having gone through all that, it feels different now. I'm just there that day. So there is, you can sort of accelerate some of these lessons. You just don't necessarily want to.
It's true. I want to say something in defense of millennials. Actually, the research actually shows that young people who kind of find out their purpose early on actually, and it's a generative purpose, it's not about them, it's not about ambition and all of that, they actually are much higher and they're much healthier than young people who focus more on, you know, climbing the ladder and doing very well, having great ambition. I also want to say something good about millennials because they get a bad rap. And when I look at millennials, what I see are people who, there are really two secrets that I found that are very important to thriving in the second half of life. One of them is purpose in life, and the other is friendships. All relationships, but in particular friendships. Actually, they turn out to, some studies suggest that people with a network of friends do better than, or friendships are more important to health than family is. For reasons like you can distance yourself from burdensome friends, but you can't distance yourself from burdensome relatives, for example. So, so millennials are really good at emphasizing friendships. They've got that piece really right, and it's impressive, and I think it's going to help them throughout their whole lives. In terms of I interviewed many people who did have their second or third career as of 55, 60, 65. And what was really exciting about this was that people had a real clear sense of how they wanted to spend that time. They realized that, you know, at age 55, you don't have an infinite number of spins at the wheel. So you got to be really intentional about what am I going to do for this next 15, 20 years. I really want it to count for something. And so the people who have done that have done very well. There's a psychoanalyst named Carlos Stringer in Israel, and he gave me one of the great insights for me, at least as I thought through my career. And what he said is that, you know, by the time you are 45, 50, you know you have enough biography to know what you're good at and what you're not good at, what you like doing and what you don't like doing. He has a term for it. He says, you know your so sign, or your essence, the stuff that just really is you. Like, it is a good thing that you guys didn't hire me to do your taxes because I am not a detail-oriented number person. But I do like telling stories, and so it's not surprising I became a journalist. So once you reach this kind of middle time, you really do know, you have a good sense of what I'm good at, what I find meaningful, and how can I pivot? How can I use these next few years to do that thing that's meaningful, that I am uniquely qualified to do?
And that's what your book is about. You actually work through that process in your own life. You know, a big takeaway, I've become an evangelist on this, and it's a huge theme of the book, is right here, right now, people in this room and our society are getting the single biggest gift, I would argue, in the entire history of the human species. So while you're all busy being depressed at all the bad stuff in the newspaper, remember that we are getting an additional 10, 15, eventually 20 years of additional healthy, vigorous life in what turns out to be the most happy and pro-social period of life. And all we need to do to take advantage of that is retire the myth that we peak in midlife, and if we don't feel peaked, then we are having a midlife crisis, and after that, we retire, play golf, and die. That is the whole wrong way to think about it.
Okay, I'm going to ask Jonathan one last question, then we'll go to questions. And that is, did writing this book change your politics at all?
Wow.
Wow, what an interesting question. It was a relief from politics. It changed the word, the T word, does not appear in this book. And given what's going on around us, doing a 3-year project of immersing myself in everything from brain science to ancient wisdom about wisdom reminded me of the things that are really important. In one very nerdy respect, it changed my politics. This is Brookings, so I guess I have to go full nerd. So I would have said, like a lot of economic-minded people, I said 5 years ago, inequality may not look good, but it doesn't really matter. What matters in life is reducing poverty and reducing social immobility. So if the poor are getting richer, but the rich are getting even richer, that's just fine. Well, theoretically, I still think that's true, but I no longer believe it has any relevance to the human species. It turns out that people's happiness depends on their status above all, and they measure their status by looking at the people around them, and if they feel like they're falling behind other people, it doesn't matter if you show to them that they're better off than their parents were. All happiness is relative, all happiness is local, and that's a big cause of malaise in this country, and I've come to think that if conservatives and classical liberals care about political stability and having a society where you don't have a lot of anger and a lot of bad policy, they need to start caring about inequality in a way that they have rejected in the past. Does that count as political change?
It does, a big one. Okay, we'll go to the floor. We only ask that your questions be long and rambling with no question at the end. And,
yeah, we have 20 minutes for the first question.
By academic qualification, we're going to go to Carol Graham in the back.
Thank you, Jonathan, for a great book, and to all of you for a great panel. David, I'm obviously going to push back a little bit, and I think
Why did I know that?
I think your criticisms are valid when you look at the early studies, when we were just blunt-tooled economists using whatever happiness question happened to be in a survey. Over time, we've learned a tremendous amount from psychologists and work very closely with them, and have come to a lot of consensus on what Jonathan was talking about, that we're measuring well-being more generally. Happiness is a term that sells a lot of books. It's in the title of my book because it sells books, but it's not particularly in the title of Jonathan's book. But it isn't really a well-defined term. There's short-term happiness, there's life evaluation. We're starting to measure eudaimonia directly with a lot of interesting findings. But if you, back to where you put Donald Trump on the happiness scores, turns out if you look at a bell curve of the distribution of happiness across individuals around the world, the least happy people care most about money, and the happiest people care about creativity, learning, volunteering, all the things that you spirituality, all the things that you talked about as sort of higher purpose, happiness. And so we're really starting to tease that out a lot, and that's why there's this whole debate about how much income matters. Well, income matters because it's not good to be destitute, but after a certain amount of income, it won't give you spirituality and friends and volunteering and whatever. And just, I guess, on Jonathan's point about inequality, mobility, mixed with purpose in life, we've been doing a lot of work looking at premature mortality among less than college educated, primarily whites in this country. And if you look at their well-being metrics, their hope for the future, their happiness levels, their anger, their stress, their desperation, they all match basically a profile of lack of purpose and complete desperation in life because they've lost their way of being and living. And they're essentially doing the opposite of being happy, which is killing themselves early. So I think there's a lot we can get from these metrics. They have their flaws, but I couldn't resist pushing back.
Understood. Let's, unless you guys have a comment, let's go right here, and then we'll come up.
Thanks, Edward Luce from the Financial Times. I'm just about to turn 50 next month, so life after 50, you've made me happy, thank you. My question is that in your very good presentation at the beginning, you showed that Americans are happier than foreigners. So it's really, what's the matter with foreigners? And it seems also from your graphs that chimpanzees are happier than foreigners too. What's wrong with us?
So the best work on that's been done on that has been done by the person standing 10 feet behind you. I'm almost inclined to turn it over to Carol Graham because those numbers come from her. Where you are matters. So that's why we know that the happiness curve is not completely biological. Countries like Scandinavia, which have stable social environments and high social capital and trust and solid income, do very well. America does almost as well, though not as well as Scandinavia. If you want to be happy, don't be Russian. Because not only is the happiness curve, there is a curve there, but it's way lower because the average level of happiness is lower. And you still have a curve, but it bottoms out much later. Like in this country, it's late 40s, early 50s or so. In Russia, it's like early 60s. And in Russia, the average person is dead by then. So yeah, it varies a lot by country and by what's going on in the country and what the social climate is like.
I'm reminded when the Soviet Union fell and Russia became an independent state, they wanted to teach the Russians, the BBC did, how to do capitalism. So they had a soap opera where people would start businesses. It was meant to display how you would start a business, what profit and loss is. But because they hired Russian writers, the businesses all went bankrupt in the end, and the owner committed suicide. And they right here in the front.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Charlie Cobb. Two quick questions. One, whatever happened to second childhood? And then the second question is, what has your work shown for couples that are married with a long age difference between them? My parents I think had a happy marriage, but they were 19 years difference between them. So they were at different points on the happiness curve. What has your research shown about what we used to call May-December marriages in law school? Thank you.
The second one, I just don't know. I haven't seen any research on that. Carol, have you seen any? Oops, you're busy. Have you seen any research on marital age differences and happiness?
No, the one thing I've seen is that I know is that one of the findings about married people being happier is an artifact of construction in the data, which is a funny way to talk about marriage. But what you have is happier people are more likely to marry each other. And so the long-term effects of getting married last about 18 months, and then the happier people just go back to their happiness levels. There is work on asymmetry in happiness levels. So there's a paper by a good friend, colleague of mine, Claudia Senek in Paris, called You Can't Be Happier Than Your Wife, This isn't about age, but it's about happiness differences. And it turns out the probability of divorce is highest when you have a happy person married to an unhappy person. It's better to have two miserable people married to each other than a happy and an unhappy person.
Harold, did you say 18 months? I've got to go. We've got a question right
We're praying
there.
for you. And the first one, whatever happened to second childhood? Is it second childhood a phrase that meant senility, or what's now known as dementia?
Or is it
What does second
adolescence?
childhood mean?
Is
I
it
don't know what
adolescence?
second
is it?
childhood means, but people, whatever it means, people are now talking about second adulthood, encore adulthood. There's a bunch of stuff in that. There are people out there working right now mostly in the private sector, but philanthropies and educational establishments and corporations to harness some of this energy of all these people who are in their 60s and 70s who are in this mode of life where they're very vigorous and they know a lot and they want to give back, but they don't want to punch in, punch out in a sort of everyday career job. So we're trying to figure out how to harness those people, and encore adulthood is becoming something people talk about. So it's going to be second adulthood now, not second childhood.
And right there on the aisle, either right, just to your left. Yeah.
Do you know why chimpanzees and other primates have a similar curve? I mean, is there a reason?
No. This is observed in observational groups in multiple continents, and it's good, reliable data, but no. Unfortunately, it turns out when you ask them, you do not get good data. So what we can do with that knowledge is it tells us that something probably fairly fundamental is going on in other primates, including human beings. And in our case, we can do both science and introspection to figure out what it is. And it does seem that we are primed by evolution for reasons that we get into in the book. But we are primed to reboot emotionally and be repurposed toward being less ambitious and self-seeking and giving back more to our communities, our children, our grandchildren, generativity. And that may be why humans are almost unique in all of nature. I think there are only 2 other species where the females live on for decades past the end of fertility. That doesn't happen. In nature, if you're not fertile, you're useless, you go away. That's not true of humans, and the reason seems to be that keeping older humans around, like keeping older pilot whales around, helps the entire society to flourish, including younger people, and including people who don't have kids. So evolution seems to be putting us through that, and maybe something similar is going through with primates.
And could I just mention one of my favorite, as long as we're talking about animal studies, one of my favorite was done of bees. And what they did is the researchers took 3 generations, they had 3 generations of bees. And so you had the little tiny bees that needed to be, tended to, and the parent bees. And then you had the Alzheimer demented grandparent bees. Seriously, like they'd fly around and they'd bump into things and things like that. So what these researchers did is they took out the parent bees. And so now the grandparent bees had to go out and find the food and take care of the young and all of that. Suddenly, and they've actually studied their little bee brains, and both when looking at their bee brains and looking at their behavior, it's like they went back to being parent bees. They kind of stripped off years. And so what that tells you is that we should always have a role in life, right? And the worst thing you can do is just think, oh, well, I have no use, there's no use for me anymore, because that's a surefire way to bump into things.
Now, I just have a quick question from me. You both have spent years thinking about happiness. One of the things notorious in literature is it's very hard to describe. There's a Tolstoy short story, Family Happiness. But have you come across either a biography or a novel where you think, that's a great description of happiness?
Wow. Great.
That's a good question, because the best description is self-revelation. And it doesn't sound very scientific, but it turns out that if you ask people, this classic question that's been around since the 50s, which is, imagine you're on a ladder, and the first rung, 1, is the worst possible life you can imagine for yourself. And 10 is the best possible life you can imagine yourself. Where do you place yourself? It turns out people can do that very consistently and quite accurately. But we're not telling them what the best possible life for themselves means. So no, but if you push me to the wall, I would say that Aristotle. You know, there's sometimes somebody gets something so right. You know, Madison and the Framework for Government, and Aristotle, and the deep relationship between happiness, in the big sense, life satisfaction, habit, and virtue. And you've written about this better than anyone. Character. Aristotle nailed it.
I don't have an answer, but I wonder if you do.
Yeah, you must. You work for the New York Times.
I will say, well, I have a hobby of collecting descriptions of ultimate joy. And they're mostly transcendent moments.
Yeah.
They tend to involve a lot of collective movement. Dancing on a dance floor. There's a great Zadie Smith passage about dancing, and she feels her head explode.
Yeah.
My old professor, William McNeill, described marching in World War II, and the act of collective marching in unison with the other men in his unit.
Right.
He said, I felt expanded.
Right.
And then the higher levels are the ones collective movement on behalf of some ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the best, my favorite passages from a rabbi named Wolf Scheckman who marched with King at Selma. And he said that was the most spiritual, fulfilling experience I've ever had. We felt history could change. We felt this swelling outside ourselves. And what these descriptions all have in common is that which seemed formerly inside yourself joined with something that seemed formerly outside yourself. And the skin barrier seems to fade away. And so they're moments of self-transcendence, really. But they're just moments, not full, the whole sense that your whole life is going well. Let's go right here.
Herb Rose, I'm wondering whether science gets into this discussion by measuring the endorphins that one experiences and comparing that to one's own estimate of their happiness.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I haven't seen any work on that, but the reason is that all of the stuff I look at in my book is about life satisfaction. And that's a long-term evaluative measure. That's what we get by reflecting on our lives and feeling grateful, for example, feeling satisfied. Those are bigger feelings. That's a very different concept from endorphins, which by nature are short-acting. It kind of goes to what David was just saying. The transcendent moments or ecstatic moments or euphoric moments are just that. But what we're talking about here in Thomas Cole's painting, what's so powerful about that is this is a very long journey, and we're in it for the long haul. And that's why, you know, when I was middle-aged, 45, and I felt so restless and disappointed with my life for no apparent reason because things were going great. And then I felt even angrier and more disappointed because I felt that way. I felt so ungrateful and wretched about myself for feeling so ungrateful. I got some really good advice from Barb's brother, David, who was my boss at the Atlantic, and said, he had been there 7 years ago, and he said, you'll feel restless and dissatisfied often at this stage in life, independent of your mood from day to day. And be very, very careful. This is a treacherous time in your life to make big decisions. Don't do anything impulsive. Pivot. Don't jump. And that turned out to be, in my case, just precious advice. So I pass it along to all of you, and also in the book.
Let's go right here. I'm trying to make you walk as far as possible.
Thank you. John Nelson. I work with something called Wall Street Without Walls, where retired investment bankers can give of their expertise as a form of philanthropy. Quick question. Have you looked at how to use the wealth of a home to age in place? Aging in place seems to be a strategy, but the wealth of the home is principal wealth of most Americans anyway as they get older. Can you talk about how that could play into happiness? And then a sort of Buddhistic question, do we have less desire as we get older, and that's why we're happier?
Wow.
So
I don't know about homes. What do you think?
Environment matters, And this is a whole separate conversation, which we probably won't get into. But in a previous life, I looked into aging and aging options and why medicalization and hospitalization are terrible things for older people and why it really matters to have communities where you can age in place in a trusted environment. And all of those things are important. They don't directly bear on the happiness curve, which, remember, is independent of your circumstances and surroundings. What was the second?
Do we have less desire?
Oh, no, we don't have less desire. You know, you might think the reason the happiness curve helps you as you age in being happy is because we become more numb about our emotions or more confused about our emotions, or we don't feel as much. Turns out that's not true. We have strong emotions. We're just better at managing them, and they pass more quickly. And by the same token, wait, what was the specific aspect? I got lost for a second time. They're showing my age.
That was, no. I think you answered.
Oh, and desire. Yeah, you still have the desire, but it changes its focus.
Yeah.
As we age, what it is, this castle in the sky that we're reaching for is a lot less about social status, which is a treadmill. There's no satisfaction in that. The further you get towards social status, the more you want yet more social status, and the more unhappy you become. Even to the point of winning the presidency. Oops, I went there. But it turns out the things that we tend to focus our desire on later in life, personal connection, giving back to our community, our families, our loved ones, those actually you can put in the bank. They really do make you feel fulfilled. So our desire shifts toward things that are better for people around us in many ways and better for ourselves.
And you know, you can actually see this in brain studies because Laura Carstensen, among others, has looked at people who are young, middle-aged, and older as they view pictures. And some of the pictures are really disturbing, really upsetting. Some of the pictures are happy faces, that kind of thing. What they found is that the young people focus in on the disturbing pictures, and the older people they disattend. They ignore.
Yeah, they see it.
Right, they see it, but it doesn't process in the same way. And so in both cases, and they focus heavily on the happy faces. And so it's not that people are feeling less. It's just what they're feeling. They have a different object to their feeling. They are focusing on the good things as opposed to the things that make them anxious. And so it's a much better way to live.
Let's do one more if there is way there in the back.
Hi, my name's Jake. I'm 23 years old, and I'm at a point where I have a general idea of... yeah, exactly. I have a general idea of what I'm good at and what I care about, climate change and the kind of impact I want to have. But right now, the job horizon is really diverse. So I'm wondering if you could kind of go back and advise your younger self on your first career move, would you have changed anything knowing now what you do about happiness?
That's a really good question.
David Brooks is the perfect person to answer that question.
You're not punning that easily. It's your damn book.
There's a lot to say about that, but I'll make it very short because we're out of time, and David's got an anniversary to celebrate. And I'll just say what I found, I took a conventional course. I started at a newspaper because I wanted to be a writer. But what I tell people who are 22 and 23, the labor market is really good at finding out what you're good at and encouraging you to do more of what you're good at and less of what you're not good at. And all you really need to do is get a boat in the water one way or another, and the current will guide you. It almost doesn't matter in your 20s what you do as long as you're not bored and stagnant. That would be my general suggestion. Others?
That's great. Let's end it there.
Jonathan Rauch and Barbara Redland.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.